They tell you that the mountain doesn't have a voice. They're wrong. When you're perched 14 stories above the jagged granite of the Cabinet Mountains in a 14 by 14 foot glass box, the mountain speaks to you every hour of the day. It groans through the steel stilts beneath your feet. It shrieks through the aluminum window frames. And in the dead of winter, when the temperature drops to 40 below and the world turns into a featureless void of white, the mountain starts to whisper things you'd rather not hear. My name is Mark. I'm not a survivalist and I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who wanted to be forgotten. After the funeral, the noise of the city felt like broken glass in my head. So, when the Forest Service posted a winter contract for Tower 4, I took it before the ink was dry. It pays triple because most people lose their minds by week 3. Total isolation. No visitors. Just the sky, the ice, and the silence. I remember the day the transport chopper dropped me off. The pilot didn't even shut down the engine. He just tossed my crates onto the helipad, gave me a look that felt like a pitying prayer, and hauled tail before the next front moved in. I watched the black speck of the helicopter vanish into the grey horizon, and that's when it hit me. I was officially the highest living thing in Montana. The tower is an architectural relic, a square observation deck sitting on 4 massive steel legs. To get inside, you have to climb a series of open great metal stairs. In the wind, the whole structure sways. Not much, just enough to make your coffee ripple in the mug, just enough to remind you that you're held up by nothing but rust and math. The first week was a dream. I spent my mornings melting snow for water and my afternoons staring at the peaks. But then I found the logbook. It was tucked under the leg of the propane stove, used to keep the unit level. It belonged to Miller, the ranger I was replacing. He hadn't finished his term. The official report said medical evacuation for exhaustion, but the logbook told a different story. The entries started normal: weather patterns, snow depth, radio checks. But by mid-November the handwriting changed. It became cramped, shaky. November 14th, heard a metallic clack on the stairs tonight. Too heavy for a bird, too light for a bear. November 18th, the bottom step. One single thud. 3 a.m. exactly. Checked with the spotlight. Nothing there. No tracks. The last page didn't have a date. It just had a series of tally marks scratched so deep into the paper they had torn through to the other side. Dozens of them. And at the bottom, in a tiny, terrified script, were 4 words. He's measuring the height. I laughed it off. Solitude does strange things to the brain. I threw the book in a drawer and brewed a fresh pot of coffee. I told myself Miller was just another guy who couldn't handle the quiet. That night, the wind died down for the first time since I'd arrived. The silence was absolute. I lay in my cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle. And then I heard it. From 40 feet below, at the very base of the tower where the steel meets the frozen rock, came a sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. A single, heavy, metallic impact on the bottom step, like someone had dropped a bowling ball wrapped in wet leather. I checked my watch. 3 a.m. I walked to the window and looked down into the blackness, my heart hammering against my ribs. I saw nothing but the swirl of frozen mist. But as I stood there, the tower didn't just sway. It shuddered, like something immense had just reached out and gripped one of the steel stilts to see how much it could bend. The next morning, the sun was a pale, sickly coin behind the clouds. I told myself the sound was just the steel contracting in the cold. Physics, not phantoms. But as I drank my coffee, I noticed the frost on the windows. Usually, it formed in beautiful, crystalline ferns. But on the south-facing pane, the frost was smeared, as if something wide and flat had been pressed against the glass from the outside. I spent the day trying to reach base. I toggled the frequency, adjusted the squelch, and checked the antenna on the roof. Nothing but white noise. But as I listened to the static, a pattern emerged. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic. 3 short bursts, 1 long. It sounded like a heartbeat, translated into electricity. Thump, thump, thump. Thump. I pulled Miller's logbook out again. I turned to the back, looking for anything I might have missed. There, tucked into the binding, was a Polaroid photo. It was a shot of the stairs taken from the top landing. It looked normal at first, but when I looked closer, I saw a handrail near the bottom was bent outward at a 90-degree angle. Miller had circled it in red ink. Underneath, he'd written, "It doesn't use the stairs to climb. It uses them to pull itself up." That night, I didn't go to bed. I sat in the center of the room in a wooden chair, my hunting knife on the table, and a heavy-duty maglite in my lap. I turned off the interior lights. I wanted to see out, but all I could see was my own terrified face reflected in the glass. 3 a.m. arrived with a silence so heavy it felt like it was crushing the tower. Then I heard the sound. The sound wasn't at the bottom anymore. It was higher, much higher. It was the sound of a heavy weight hitting the metal grate of the midway landing, 20 feet up. The entire tower lurched to the left. I heard the scream of a bolt shearing off somewhere in the dark below. I scrambled to the window and clicked on the maglite. The beam cut through the swirling snow like a lightsaber. I swept it down the stairs. Empty. The metal stairs were coated in a fresh layer of untouched powder. No footprints, no signs of a struggle. But the handrail at the midway landing, the heavy steel bar I had gripped just hours before, was twisted into a pretzel. It looked like someone had squeezed it with the casual strength of a person crushing a soda can. I retreated to the center of the room, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I realized then that whatever was out there wasn't a man. A man has a weight that leaves a print. A man has a limit to his reach. Then the static started again. It wasn't on the radio this time. It was coming from the floorboards, a low, vibrating hum that made the soles of my boots tingle. It was a sound of immense effort, like a heavy engine straining. And then came the new sound, a wet, sliding, slurping and scraping noise. It was the sound of something moist and cold dragging itself up the exterior steel stilts. It wasn't using the stairs at all. It was coming up the legs of the tower like a spider. I grabbed the maglite and ran to the trapdoor in the floor, the only way in or out. I checked the deadbolt. It was secure. But as I stared at the wood, a drop of water fell from the ceiling and landed on my hand. I looked up. There was no leak in the roof. The water wasn't coming from a pipe. It was condensation. A thick, foggy mist was beginning to form on the inside of the windows, following a path that moved in a circle around the room. Something was moving around the outside of my glass box, 40 feet in the air, on the wind. Then I heard the rap on the glass, a single, sharp rap on the glass behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. The light hit the window, and for a split second, I saw it. A finger. It was longer than a human forearm, translucent and pale, with a jagged yellowed nail. It wasn't touching the glass. It was vibrating against it so fast it looked like a blur. And then the tapping moved. Tap, 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 tap. It was mimicking my heartbeat. I didn't move. I couldn't. I stood in the center of that 14 by 14 room. a prisoner of my own perspective. When you're surrounded by glass, there is nowhere to hide. You are a display piece. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had started. The silence that followed was worse. It was a heavy, expectant vacuum. The wind had dropped to a ghostly whistle, and for the first time, I could hear the tower breathing. The steel stilts groaned under a weight that didn't belong to the wind. I slowly panned my maglite across the north-facing windows. Nothing. I panned to the east. Nothing. Then I turned toward the west, the side facing the sheer 2,000-foot drop of the cabinet cliffside. My breath hitched. The beam of my light hit something pale. At first, I thought it was a birch tree caught in the storm, but there are no trees that high. It was a hand, but calling it a hand felt like a lie. It was a sprawling, skeletal arrangement of bone and translucent skin, the fingers as long as my legs, splayed out across the glass like a massive, frozen spider. The knuckles were the color of a drowned man's lips, a bruised, icy purple. They were pressed so hard against the glass that I could hear the pane beginning to micro-crack. Tink, tink, tink. I should have run. I should have bolted for the trap door. But my muscles were lead. I watched, paralyzed, as a second hand appeared at the top of the frame, gripping the roof's edge. And then it rose. It didn't climb up like a man. It elongated. A head emerged from the bottom of the window frame, moving upward with a smooth, sickening fluidity. There was no neck, just a column of white, corded muscle that seemed to stretch forever into the darkness below. The face. It haunts me more than the hands. It was the color of a mushroom grown in a cellar. It was hairless, features stretched tight over a skull that was too long, too narrow. It had no nose, just two vertical slits that pulsed with every shallow breath it took. But the eyes were the worst part. They were huge, milky spheres, clouded over with thick, white cataracts. They looked like two marble moons. They didn't have pupils, yet I felt, the exact moment they locked onto mine. It wasn't standing on a ledge. It wasn't on the stairs. It was simply there, hovering in the howling abyss outside the glass, defying every law of gravity I knew. I backed away until my spine hit the hot surface of the propane heater, but I didn't feel the burn. I only felt the cold radiating from the window. The frost on the glass was spreading now, turning into thick, jagged ice where the thing's face was pressed. Then its mouth opened. It didn't have teeth. It had rows of needle-thin, translucent ridges. It didn't scream. It didn't growl. Instead, the air in the room suddenly vibrated. The shortwave radio on the desk sparked to life, emitting a burst of static that shaped itself into a sound. "Mark!" It was a whisper. But it wasn't the raspy, monstrous voice you'd expect. It was a woman's voice, warm, familiar. It was my mother's voice, the exact tone she used to use when she sat at the edge of my bed to wake me for school 20 years ago. "Mark, honey, it's cold out here. Let me in." My heart didn't just race, it skipped. My mind screamed that it was a trick, a biological lure like an anglerfish in the deep. But some primal, grieving part of me wanted to reach for the latch. "The tower is so high, Mark," the voice whispered through the radio, perfectly synced with the rhythmic pulsing of the creature's throat slits. "I'm tired of measuring. Let's see how far the bottom is. Together." The glass gave a violent crack. A fissure appeared right between those milky, moon-like eyes. The sound of the glass cracking snapped the spell. That wasn't my mother. My mother was buried under 6 feet of Georgia clay, and whatever was mimicry looping her voice through my radio was something that had never known a human heart. The fissure in the pane widened. I saw a thin, grey mist, the creature's breath, seeping through the crack. It smelled like old pennies and stagnant pond water. I didn't think. I grabbed the Orion flare gun from the emergency kit. My hands were shaking so violently I nearly dropped the plastic orange grip. I leveled it at the center of that milky, moon-sized eye. "Get back," I croaked. The creature's mouth widened, stretching impossibly far down its neck, revealing a throat that looked like an endless black pipe. It didn't flinch. It just repeated my own words back to me, in my own gravelly voice. "Get back." I pulled the trigger. The flare didn't go through the glass. It hit the pane and shattered it completely. A ball of blinding, 3,000-degree red magnesium light exploded. For a second, the tower was as bright as the sun. The creature shrieked, a sound like metal grinding on metal, and recoiled, falling backward into the 2,000-foot dark of the cliffside. But I didn't wait to see if it hit the bottom. The wind rushed into the tower, a 70-mile-per-hour freezing gale that knocked over my chairs and blew out my heater. The structural integrity was gone. I heard the steel stilts scream as the weight of the wind began to tilt the glass box toward the abyss. I lunged for the trapdoor in the floor. I ripped it open and threw myself onto the metal stairs. I descended those 40 feet like a madman, my boots slipping on the frost-slicked grates. Every time I passed a landing, I felt a whoosh of air behind me, the sensation of a long, cold finger narrowly missing the back of my neck. I hit the ground and didn't look back. I sprinted for my snowmobile, the engine coughing twice before roaring into life. I pinned the throttle, flying over the snow, the headlight cutting a desperate path through the whiteout. I drove for 3 hours until the sun began to bleed over the horizon. I didn't stop until I reached a diner on the outskirts of Troy. I sat in a booth, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee I couldn't feel, shivering so hard the ceramic clattered against my teeth. The waitress looked at me with a mix of pity and fear. "Rough night on the mountain?" she asked. I just nodded. I couldn't speak. I reached up to rub the back of my neck, feeling a strange, numb sensation there. That's when I felt it. The skin wasn't just cold, it was hard. I walked to the bathroom and turned toward the mirror, pulling down the collar of my heavy flannel shirt. There, on the nape of my neck, was a mark. It wasn't a bruise. It was a perfect, frost-white handprint, the fingers impossibly long, wrapping around to my throat. And as I watched in the mirror, a new line of frost began to grow from the print, crawling up toward my ear. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text message from an unknown number. I opened it. It was a voice memo. I pressed play, and the diner's ambient noise seemed to fade away. It was my own voice, recorded only seconds ago, from inside that very bathroom. "Rough night on the mountain, Mark," followed by a sound I'll never forget. The rhythmic, metallic tap, tap, tap of a fingernail on the other side of the bathroom mirror.